Welcome back. We begin our top stories this morning in South Africa. A new vaccine discovery by scientists could spell good news for hundreds of thousands of children across the world. Respiratory syncytial virus (RSV) is the second leading cause of death during the first year of a child's life after malaria, killing between 100,000 and 200,000 babies every year. But a study that found a new vaccine that targets this virus promises to change things radically.
In South Africa, the virus has led to 44,615 hospitalizations and 490 deaths in children under 5 each year. Now, according to the National Institute of Communicable Diseases surveillance program, the country is currently experiencing an RSV epidemic with 301 cases detected this year. Now, joining us to discuss this further is medical epidemiologist Jocelyn Moyes. Thanks for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning, everybody.
Let's start with talking about this new RSV vaccine. How does it work, and would you say it is safe for children?
So the vaccine, this particular one you're talking about, is aimed at vaccinating mothers during their pregnancies to protect the very young infant who is most at risk for severe respiratory syncytial virus. Let's call it RSV because it's a lot easier. Disease. So you give the vaccine to the mom while she's pregnant, and she builds up antibodies, which she then passes on to the child through the placenta and through breastfeeding. And then so that very young child between the age of 1 and 3 months is protected from RSV, severe RSV disease.
So, I mean, it's great news you're saying that this has been administered to the mom and then protects the child. If we look at the current statistics, numbers, or, the frequency with which this occurs, how would you say, how much at risk would you say mothers and the children in South Africa have been to this epidemic?
So, we see RSV all year round in South Africa, and probably very similar in Nigeria, considering that you're in a tropical, in a sort of tropic zone. We see it all year round, but we do have a seasonal peak every year, and it's during this peak that we see most of the cases. Our data shows that we see about 6,000 cases per 100,000 children of severe RSV illness. So that's illness that puts them in hospital in the first 2 months of life in infants in that 1 and 2 month age group. So you can see that it's a very common cause of respiratory illness, and it commonly puts very small children or young babies in hospital for their illness.
Yeah. Now, let's also talk about the success of the vaccine. Over time, of course, across the continent, there's always some level of vaccine hesitancy and whatnot. Has South Africa, seen stuff like that in the past? And how positive are you that the vaccine will be a success, considering that it's not the first one to be introduced for pneumonia?
Okay, so the different causes of pneumonia, and so we have vaccines against the pneumococcus and against Haemophilus influenzae. These are both bacteria that also cause pneumonia in very young infants. Now, this vaccine is specifically aimed at RSV, which is the most common viral cause of pneumonia. So we sort of adding vaccines to our group of vaccines that are protecting these very young infants. The burden is extremely high in small children, and so the vaccine would have a very big effect. If it could prevent 80% of children from getting severe illness, and so in other words, maybe getting a mild illness but doesn't even require medical care, or a mild illness that doesn't require them to be hospitalized, and then of course there's the deaths that it could prevent. Vaccine hesitancy is everywhere, and I think it's important that people get a clear message that this is what it can do and what it can't do. And there's the specific trial that you read about shows that it's very safe. So there were very, very few side effects to the vaccine, and I think also sometimes giving it to the mom is a little bit easier than giving it to the child, because it doesn't feel perhaps as invasive when given to the mother as it might to the child.
I'm glad that you just touched on that, because I was about to ask you, what the potential side effects are, because there have been speculations. There have been articles and reports that have claimed that there are maybe dangerous side effects to using this vaccine, which is of course one of the reasons why we do see an increased level in vaccine hesitancy. One of the claims would be that use of or administration of this vaccine to older adults causes Guillain-Barré syndrome. And I don't know, if there is any confirmation to this yet, and if there has been a clear-cut explanation as to what exactly the side effects are. As we know that most medications do have side effects. So is there any truth to this claim, and are there any clear indications of what the side effects of using this vaccine are?
Okay. So, of course, vaccines have to go through quite rigorous trials, including safety trials, and then trials to see whether it works when to actually prevent what you're trying to prevent. And so this trial that you've read about is the end of a series of a number of safety and efficacy trials. And so this is the sort of trying to put the vaccine into the real life situation. So it's the final phase of trials. And really, there was no indication of harm by this vaccine in the trials that have been done. Now that the trials are done, it's really now all that information has to go to regulatory authorities. And so it will likely go to the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration in the US, as a first pass. And there it will go through a very, very systematic, intensive review by people. And then, of course, in Africa, we have to put it through our own regulatory authorities. And our regulatory authorities need to have a good look at the evidence. But really, this trial showed an effective vaccine and a safe vaccine. So, there are always going to be fringe people who don't like vaccines, but I really believe that this trial is showing that there are no safety concerns for this vaccine.
It will still take a bit of convincing, because I did get to see some of the responses to the RSV vaccine, and of course the maker of the vaccine, did get some criticism from the COVID vaccine period. And so it would still, maybe require some level of convincing, that, to let people know that it is safe to use and some of all of that. The big pharma generally at this time in the world, is under a lot of scrutiny with regards the safety of vaccines and the effectiveness of vaccines and some of all of that. I'm sure that you also are aware of that. But of course, let's also talk about approval, and do we expect that there would be maybe in a couple of years an end completely to RSV in South Africa?
Well, the RSV occurs all around the world, remember, and it's one of the sort of ubiquitous viruses. So it happens. It's not like children living in a malaria area are at risk of malaria, and then nobody living in America is at risk of malaria. Every child born in this world is at risk of getting severe RSV disease, whether you live in New York City or in a rural area of Nigeria. So I think that's an important thing to remember, that this is a vaccine for all children all across the world. And so it is not a South African vaccine for South African children. And I think that, I think that's very important. I think it's also really important that we have some, we have to trust the systems that are in place to check these vaccines. This is a slightly different situation to COVID, because this vaccine has been in testing for many, many years to get to this point, whereas COVID was an emergency response, although, those vaccines are safe. But I think you're right, there is a sort of, there is an awareness amongst people. Perhaps, the safety of vaccines has been brought to the fore because of, what we've dealt with in the last few years. And I think there are people who are, perhaps a bit hesitant. But the vaccines that protect young children are really, really important. We don't really like to see our babies sick and in hospital, and we really don't like to see them die. So I think we really do need to see this as a disease with a very high burden and with a potentially very exciting intervention to prevent young infants.
All right. Moise, thank you so much. Jocelyn Moise, I beg your pardon. Thank you so much for your time this morning. It's going to be an ongoing conversation. But of course, I think the big points are protecting children. And of course, the reaction that people would have to vaccines, from certain, companies in the next couple of years. But most importantly, protecting children. Thanks for your time. We look forward to speaking with you again.
Thanks very much.
Absolutely.